Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to wrap up some recent reads. So here's the thing. I fucked up. I filmed my January wrap-up a little bit early, thinking I might just read maybe one more book before the month was over that I could just easily roll over into my next wrap-up, but then I read 3 books. Then I read 3 more books for Blackathon within like the first week of February, so I'm just putting them all together and we're gonna discuss. So the first book I finished in the last week of January was My Arc of Ramon and Julieta by Alana Quintana Albertson. This came out on February 1st from Berkeley, and it's an adult romance that, as I'm sure you can tell, is a twist on a Romeo and Juliet type story, but with Mexican-American characters whose families own and operate rival Mexican restaurants. The story goes that Julieta's mother and Ramon's father met many years ago in Mexico, and Ramon's father not only left her behind, but stole her family's infamous recipe for fish tacos and used it to build a very successful multi-million-dollar franchise in the States. When Julieta's mother eventually immigrated to San Diego and opened her own business, she found significantly less success. So that's why their families are feuding, and in the midst of this, Ramon and Julieta unknowingly meet each other and hit it off at a swanky party for Dia de los Muertos. It's not until after a failed hookup attempt that Julieta realizes not only is this her competition, but also her soon-to-be landlord, since he recently bought an entire block of historic Latina businesses. Content warnings for some discussions of divorce, infidelity, and parental estrangement, references to parental death and grief, brief mention of ICE and deportation, some explorations of gentrification, and some explicit sexual content. I have a pretty in-depth written review which I will include down below, so I'm going to try to keep this brief. Overall, I enjoyed this. It's a solid romance, it does what it sets out to do, and I appreciate that it makes space to discuss serious topics. As a Romeo and Juliet inspired romance, I like that this story is not a one-to-one exact retelling of the original, but rather it uses that tension as a foundation for the dynamic between the characters, and I appreciate that the story actually provides context for why these families are feuding in the first place. What I enjoy most about the story is that it has a very strong sense of culture, history, and place. It's set in Barrio Logan in San Diego, which is a real historical location, and I love that the setting is such a prominent part of the story as opposed to an afterthought. But for me, the actual romance feels a little bit superficial at times, the steaminess feels perfunctory, and while I appreciate that it tries to comment on the very serious phenomenon of gentrification, I'm not entirely sure that it succeeds. I don't really know how one defines a billionaire romance, as they're called, but I think this story might be borderline going in that direction, and I just can't really get behind that dynamic because billionaires to me are not really empathetic heroes. If that's your thing, I support you, it's just not mine, and for this story specifically, it feels a bit ironic that money is both the cause of the problem and also possibly the solution. There's a dissonance there that I don't think is properly addressed. I want to be very clear, I do not regret the time I spent with this story. It's enjoyable, it's entertaining, it has some escapist romantic moments, but when it comes to lasting power, it kind of misses the mark. There are some character inconsistencies, it can get a little bit cheesy with the characters unironically quoting Shakespeare at each other, and some of the historical research could have been better integrated as well. But like I said, it's a solid romance, I appreciate the celebration of Mexican-American culture, I respect what the author was trying to accomplish, and ultimately that's why I gave it 3 stars. After that, since I had recently read The Silvered Serpents, I had no choice but to pick up The Bronze Beasts by Roshni Chokshi. It's become kind of a running joke that I don't know how to summarize this series, but I am doing my best. This is the 3rd and final installment in a YA historical fantasy trilogy that takes place in the late 1800s in France. It's inspired by the Tower of Babel, which is a creation story about this mythical tower that was built up to the heavens, and when it was destroyed, the pieces were scattered all across the world and became the various languages and cultures that we know today, and if those pieces were to be reunited, it could potentially unleash some very dangerous magic. This is where the highly secretive Order of Babel comes in, and they collect various articles of creation and also protect any recovered Babel fragments and make sure that they are kept apart. The main cast of characters are highly skilled treasure hunters who are both working with and against the Order to make sure that those fragments don't fall into anyone else's hands. Content warnings for descriptions of human sacrifice, blood, and death, references to racism, colorism, anti-Semitism, and anti-blackness, brief instances of self-harm and reported suicide, and some graphic injury and violence. And as always, it's worth noting that this series has representation for characters who are biracial, Haitian, Algerian, Indian, Filipino, Jewish, queer, and autistic. And when I say queer, I can now be specific and confirm that there are characters who are bisexual, aromantic, and polyamorous. I really don't know what else to say about this trilogy that I haven't already said. This finale far exceeded my expectations. I knew it was going to severely mess with my emotions, and yet even knowing that going into it, I still was not prepared. Picture me finishing this book alone in my room at 1 a.m. in the dark, just pacing vigorously and verbally bargaining with Roshni Chokshi like, Roshni, please, we cannot do this. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality when I finished this book in the best possible way. I cried, I shouted, I bargained, I was on the floor, and not even out of sadness, but just just because everything felt so utterly complete. I really don't know how to describe it. Roshani Chokshi is such a talented author because she writes with such beauty, clarity, imagination, and emotion that it really transcends the page. In this series, she has created a story that's as tragic and beautiful as it is epic, and she's able to take these characters to such great heights. I'm not even joking, I'm still processing this in real time. The overwhelming feeling is that I'm just impressed by how much Roshani Chokshi was able to accomplish in just 3 books. This third book is a little bit different in structure because the first 2 are more straightforward heists, and while this one still has that element of urgency, secrecy, and subterfuge, it feels more like the absolute pinnacle of an epic quest. It still has those trademark heist elements. There are still mysteries and puzzles and clues that need to be pieced together for the characters to make it to their endgame, but the stakes are so much higher than just getting away with theft. I've said this pretty much every time I bring up this series, but this trilogy is really about found family. It's about the lengths these characters will go to in hopes of protecting the people they love and doing right by the people they love, even if doing so means making tough choices. That is what I'm going to remember most looking back on this series, that Roshani Chokshi was able to craft these endearing, emotional, complex characters who just want to make their mark on the world in some way and who want to feel like they matter to someone else. The relationships between these characters are not perfect, and these treasure hunts definitely put those bonds to the test. But when push comes to shove, there's no one else they would trust more to be by their sides. If I haven't already sold you on this series, I never will. It has everything you could possibly want. Unforgettable characters, fantastic banter, an unerring sense of adventure and wonder, top-notch action and mystery, incredibly high stakes. What else can I say at this point? It is the perfect blend of history and fantasy. The prose is emotional and lush. There's a feeling of seductiveness underlying everything, and I can sincerely say that I've never read anything like it. This finale destroyed me in all the best ways, and I gave it 5 stars. The last thing I finished in January was my arc of The Jade Setter of Janloon by Fonda Lee. This comes out on April 1st from Subterranean Press. It's a standalone prequel novella in the Greenbone saga that takes place just a few years before Jade City begins, maybe less. It's a gritty urban fantasy mystery that takes place in Janloon, obviously, which is part of an island where people with the proper heritage and training can wear jade on their person, which makes them faster and stronger and grants them superhuman abilities. In this story, we're following a jade setter's apprentice, and jade setters are the artisans who craft and weld the various jewelry, piercings, and even weapons that jade-wearing people use. This particular jade setting storefront is set up in neutral territory, and the owner is not a lanternman for any clan, so they get regular business from the Greenbones, the Mountain, and everyone in between. The story starts with the Mountain Fist bringing a very valuable blade to this shop that needs to be repaired, but it ends up getting stolen overnight under very mysterious circumstances, and the apprentice feels that it's his duty to figure out what happened to it. Content warnings for anti-Indigenous sentiments, which do get challenged, descriptions of drug use and addiction, graphic descriptions of blood, injury, and death, vomit, as well as references to missing Indigenous women and instances of human trafficking. 2 things right off the bat. First of all, Fonda Lee has made it abundantly clear that she does not care about any of our feelings. And I respect that. Secondly, I was super into this. If Fonda Lee wants to spend like the next 5 years just writing novellas within this established world, I would happily read every single one. This takes all the best parts of the Greenbone saga and makes it even more genre by adding that mystery element to it. The main trilogy is all about action, politics, and family dynamics, and this novella certainly encompasses all of those things, but with a plot that's much more direct. And obviously part of that is because it's a standalone, it has to be self-contained, but it's also refreshing because we don't really get to see any straight up and down mysteries in the series. Fonda Lee had me fully invested before the end of chapter 1. There's gritty action, there's political intrigue as this previously neutral apprentice finds himself in the middle of these 2 very powerful clans, and there's a sense of desperation that comes from scrambling to solve this case. It's pretty intense for a novella, and I think it does a great job of creating an urgent but also satisfying character arc propelled by moral dilemmas and injustice. There's also some cameos from characters in the Greenbone saga that make you feel exactly as you would expect. My one critique, besides a little bit of convenience at the end, is that there's a female character at the center of this story who is the prime suspect, and I wish she was a little more involved because she ends up feeling more like a chess piece. And that sort of ties into a similar critique of the main trilogy in that it definitely showcases female characters, and especially powerful female characters, but they don't always seem to shine as brightly as the male characters do, and I'm pretty sure they're outnumbered by them as well, so that is incredibly valid, and that same pattern definitely translates in this case. But even with that in mind, I thought this was fantastic. If you love the Greenbone Saga, there's a good chance you will also enjoy this. And like I said, I would happily read so many more of these stories. I gave this 4.5 stars. Then we get into February and Blackathon, and the first book I picked up for that was A Soft Place to Land by Janae Marks. If you're following along at home, Janae Marks wrote From the Desk of Zoe Washington, which was one of my favorite books of 2021. This is her most recent book that came out at the end of last year, and it's another contemporary middle grade story about Joy, a young black girl who's kind of going through a rough transition after her father lost his job, and now they're having to sell their house and downsize. They move into an apartment where Joy will have to share a bedroom with her little sister, along with a lot of other changes, but she makes friends with another girl in the building who tells her about this secret kids-only space. It's basically like a hidden room no one else knows about, where the kids can go to either hang out together, play games, or just take a quiet moment by themselves. In this hideaway of sorts, Joy starts exchanging messages on the wall with another one of the kids who seems to also be struggling in some way, but when they suddenly stop responding, she feels compelled to try and figure out who it is so that she can make sure they're okay. Content warnings for explorations of marital tension and stress, as well as job insecurity, some discussions of parental death and grief, non-graphic references to menstruation, and some distress involving a lost pet. Janae Marks was already an auto-read author for me, but this story just further solidified that. I love how she's able to take a really simple premise and build on it to make it so layered and complex. She's so good at writing fully fleshed families especially. I really appreciate how she shows young readers that even parents, even adults, are imperfect and still in need of learning or growing just as much as kids. One of the central themes in this story is the idea of space, and I think there's a great parallel between Joy feeling that she needs space to just be a kid and how her parents also need space to work out their problems in healthy ways. And I think one of the most powerful things about this story is that it's not just an exploration of how we seek out safe spaces for ourselves, but also how we can learn to be a safe space for the people around us. The mystery elements Janae Marks is able to work into her stories are also really engaging. I love how she crafts these curious-minded young characters who are able to identify a problem or a question and then methodically figure it out. This book especially is so great for young readers because it models these young characters who discover concrete problem-solving skills and who show the importance of taking responsibility and taking the initiative. A great example is how Joy wants to start a dog walking business with her friend, and so they have to come up with a game plan to convince their parents that they're able to take on this responsibility, and that requires discussion, planning, and laying out boundaries for themselves. When things don't always go their way, they have to adjust and find alternatives that will satisfy everyone involved, and so the story is also a great example of how to navigate compromise. I love that the underlying message in this story is that you can't resist change, but you can make the best of it. You can't make time reverse itself and undo things that have already been done, but you can make things better for yourself and for the people around you if you put in the work. And most importantly, I love how the story is about giving yourself permission to feel the entire spectrum of emotions. Not only does Joy have to give herself space to feel scared or anxious or sad, but she also has to give herself permission to feel happiness. Throughout the story, she's so focused on how difficult this transition has been. She's worried about how everything feels different and how she might never have a sense of normalcy again. But in all of that change and discomfort, she's also meeting new friends, trying new things, and finding new ways to be happy exactly where she is. This is such a fantastic story about friendship, community care, and learning the importance of not only finding safe spaces, but creating safe spaces. I loved everything about it, and I gave it 5 stars. After that, I decided to dig into some romance, and I started with Digging Up Love by Chandra Bloomberg. This is a black romance and the first in a companion series, I believe. It's about an aspiring baker named Alicia who dreams of leaving her small town and opening up a cookie shop in Chicago, but she currently lives with her grandparents and works in their restaurants. One day, her grandparents discover what they believe are dinosaur bones in their backyard, which brings in local paleontologist Dr. Quentin Harris to examine the site, excavate, and oversee the entire dig and preservation process. Forced to see each other every single day, sparks of course fly between this big city academic and small town baker, but the question becomes, will they be able to trust each other and themselves enough to really pursue what they want? Content warnings for references to cancer and parental death, some instances of internalized misogyny and toxic masculinity, in-depth explorations of parental abandonment, abandonment issues, and emotional trauma, and one HP reference. Jurassic Park is one of my favorite movies of all time, and it has left a deep psychological mark on me, but it's also left me with this lifelong dinosaur fascination that I just cannot shake. And then this book comes along and it's like scratching this incredibly specific romantic itch that I didn't even know I had. I never knew I wanted a romance with a paleontologist love interest, but apparently I did. I love how this story takes these two unexpected elements that would never mix, paleontology and baking, and it makes them into a comprehensive romance that actually works. My favorite thing about this romance is the dynamic between the main characters. There's a simplicity and a sincerity to the way they flirt and joke together that I just found to be really endearing, entertaining, and sweet. I also appreciate the fact that they're both working through their own emotional baggage and that they both have to learn to let go a little bit and really give themselves a fair chance at happiness. Going back to the way the story juxtaposes paleontology and baking, I feel like the marriage of those two elements really works because fossils are such a great underlying metaphor for what the characters are working through. Alicia especially feels like she can't find a way out of her small town. She feels responsible for taking care of her grandparents, and she doesn't feel worthy of pursuing her own dreams, and all of that leads to her feeling stuck. Fossils, by definition, are things that are frozen in time, things that have been preserved by the world around them, things that have to be carefully excavated in order to be learned from, and all of that directly translates to Alicia's circumstances. But it also maps onto Quentin's experiences as well, because he's also stuck in the past and dealing with his own abandonment issues that came from his ex. I think all that ties back to fossils because even though they're relics of the past, they can also recontextualize what we know about the world, and they're part of a bigger picture that's only revealed over time, and I think that ties into the story's overarching themes as well. I think it's also notable that this is an adult romance that is very low heat, as they say. There's really no sexual content to speak of, which could make this a safe space for some romance readers who are looking for that, and I don't think it makes this romance any less. On top of that, I just thought it was refreshing to have this romance that gives the characters so many opportunities to just be together, to go on cutesy dates, and to really make the most of this sort of small town romance. In a way, there's a really good balance of emotional growth and also relatively low stakes. That said, this does definitely feel like a debut at times. It can be a little saccharine, a little cheesy, and I thought there was some unchecked toxic masculinity coming from some of the side characters, but overall I thought this was a really sweet romance. I would definitely consider reading the companion book, and I gave it a solid 3.5 stars. And then I went from one black romance to another by picking up my arc of I'm So Not Over You by Kosoko Jackson. This is Kosoko Jackson's debut queer adult romance that's coming out on February 22nd from Berkeley. It's about a black aspiring journalist named Keon Andrews who is a recent graduate, unemployed, and very, very broke. As he's trying to figure out what his next move should be, his ex, Hudson, shows up out of nowhere and asks if Keon will come to a family wedding and pretend that they're still dating because he never told his parents that they broke up. Hudson's parents also happen to be super rich and owners of a multi-billion-dollar brewing company, and he's always been the sort of black sheep of the family who has no interest in joining the family business. So Hudson's always been seen as the family disappointment, and his parents have always loved Keon for some reason, so he figures that bringing Keon with him will be a way to get them off his back. Keon initially rejects the idea, but then Hudson promises to put him in touch with some major news outlets, and that could very well be just the break that Keon needs to finally pursue his dreams. Content warnings for references to anxiety and panic attacks, some explorations of emotional trauma, past underage drinking, alcoholism, and drunk driving, instances of homophobia and classism, some descriptions of blood, violence, and sexual harassment, HP references, and explicit sexual content. This is like the absolutely chaotic, messy, adult romance I never knew I needed in my life. There's a little bit of extravagance and fantasy to it because, again, it's sort of borderline billionaire romance, but it's also super funny and grounded and authentic. This might not mean anything to anyone because the book I'm going to mention has not been distributed widely yet, not even for review, but this is like the adult version of the feeling of falling in love. If I was making an If You Like This, Read That video, I would make this match. Both stories involve super rich families, fake dating, bribing, dramatic family weddings, and queer mess. The comparison to me is so obvious to make. Anyways, I really enjoyed this. I've never read anything by Kosoko Jackson before, but I definitely would read more after this. I would say my favorite part is the main character, Keon, because he has such a strong, distinct, decisive voice. He is a mess, and not only does he know it, but he embraces it. Keon really embodies what it means to be a broke millennial 2 bad choices away from absolute financial devastation, and I like that he's not hung up on pride. He knows exactly what he wants, what he needs, and when it comes to securing those things, he is absolutely shameless. I think we need more characters like that, characters who are hyper aware of the barriers they're up against, the way the world works, and who are not going to judge themselves for doing whatever they have to do to secure stability or safety or success. And another thing that really stood out to me is how these characters are not perfect, and the story doesn't expect them to be. That was kind of refreshing to me because especially when it comes to queer stories or queer romances, there's often a feeling like they have to leave their characters in a healthy, well-adjusted place. And to be clear, that's great. great. That's needed. Having characters who learn from their mistakes and grow in healthy ways is super important, especially when it comes to expanding our imagination of what queer futures and queer happiness can look like. But sometimes it feels like we can't have imperfect queer characters because they'll be judged unfairly by cishet audiences. Sometimes it feels like we've stumbled into this unspoken agreement that if a character is going to be queer, then they have to be positive or successful or of service. They have to be a shining example of why queer people deserve dignity and humanity, when we don't actually have to be saints to be deserving of those things. So it's kind of weird to say, but the messiness between these two characters is oddly refreshing. It was nice to have these queer black characters who are not sanitized or well-adjusted or perfect. They make bad choices and mistakes. They don't have the best judgment. They're chaotic, reckless, horny, messy people who just want to be loved like so many other folks. Going back to Keon as the main character, I love that he's not afraid to say whatever he's thinking, that he really makes Hudson work for his second chance and holds him accountable for his past mistakes, and that while he may not be especially prideful, he still knows his limitations. Again, I'm not super into the billionaire thing, even though I do think Keon does a really good job of calling Hudson and his family out on their privilege and classism whenever he gets the chance. And the other tiny setback for me is that the story is written in a way where Keon's narration is happening in real time, which is fascinating in terms of craft, but could also potentially be a jarring thing to process. But I still just really enjoyed this. It's funny, it's voicey, it's in your face, it's unapologetic, it's a super fast read, it's a solid second chance romance that doesn't get hung up on image or expectations, and I had a good time with it. I gave it 4 stars. So that is what I've been reading lately. As always, if you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, feel free to stop by the comments down below and let me know what you think. But that is everything I had to share with you for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page. Bye!